Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Before we begin, please tell us where you are watching us right now. The story we're going to tell today happened more than 100 years ago in the dark mountains of North Carolina, and no one has been able to fully explain what happened to Nathaniel Burke since then. It is now 1911. The Appalachian Mountains were still a place where modern civilization hadn't really reached yet. There were dirt roads that wound their way through deep valleys and peaks that were shrouded in thick mist. North Carolina, at that time, was a place where entire communities lived isolated for weeks, where the silence of the forests hid secrets that would never reach the newspapers of the big cities. It was a different world with its own set of rules. At the age of 32, Nathaniel Burke decided to leave his life in Richmond, Virginia, and explore the mountains to the south. He was a cartographer by trade, hired by a railroad company that planned to expand its lines through Appalachia. He was an educated, meticulous man who kept a detailed diary of his expeditions. His records were almost like science in how accurate they were. He wrote down everything: temperatures, rock formations, encounters with locals, every stream he crossed. That habit, ironically, would be the only reason we now know that something terribly wrong happened in those mountains. In March of that year, Nathaniel departed Asheville with provisions for 3 weeks. They were going to Madison County, specifically a remote area near the community of Shelton Laurel. This area is known for its deep caves and dangerous canyons. He intended to map possible routes for the railroad, identify natural tunnels, and assess the stability of the terrain. It was lonely work, but Nathaniel preferred it that way. He had hired only one local guide, a man named Ezra Whitlock, who knew each trail in that region like the back of his hand. The first few days passed normally. According to Nathaniel's diary, he described the cold March weather, the trees still without full leaves, and the constant sound of water rushing through the canyons. Ezra was a competent guide, although not very communicative. On the 5th day, they found an abandoned hut on top of a hill. Nathaniel noted that the place seemed to have been left in a hurry. There were utensils scattered around, a pot still on the stove, and hanging clothes that were already rotting with the humidity. Ezra didn't want to go inside. He only said that that place had bad stories and that they should move on. But Nathaniel was a man of science. Curiosity was part of his nature. He explored the cabin while Ezra waited outside, visibly annoyed. In the diary, Nathaniel mentions finding strange markings on the interior walls, something he described as primitive symbols etched deep into the wood, forming patterns that I cannot decipher. He made sketches of these symbols in his notebook. He also mentioned finding a compartment hidden under the floorboards but did not detail what was inside. He only wrote, "I have discovered something that Ezra needs to see." I believe that this hut was not simply abandoned. From that point on, the tone of the diary changes. Nathaniel's notes become briefer, almost rushed. On the 6th day, he writes that Ezra is acting strangely, constantly looking back during the walks, insisting that they should come down from the mountains immediately. Nathaniel argued that he still had work to do, that the company expected results. Ezra would have answered something that Nathaniel recorded in quotation marks. "There are things in these mountains that maps cannot show, and places where sensible men do not go." On the 7th day, something happened. The record is confusing, fragmented. Nathaniel says that the night before, he heard sounds that he thought were voices coming from the valley below, but they weren't normal voices. They had an unnatural echo, as if they came from within the land itself. By morning, Ezra had disappeared. His rifle and groceries were still in the camp, but he wasn't there anymore. Nathaniel spent the day searching, calling, and following trails around the camp. Nothing. It was as if Ezra had been swallowed by the forest. Alone now, Nathaniel made a fateful decision. Instead of immediately going downstairs to get help, he decided to keep going. We don't know if it was professional stubbornness, fear of abandoning a man who might be hurt somewhere, or something more obscure that the diary doesn't clearly reveal, but he pressed on into even more remote areas of Appalachia. His notes from the following days speak of a growing sense of being watched, of finding footprints that made no sense, and of hearing sounds he could not identify. On the 10th day, Nathaniel found another structure. It was not a hut, but something he describes as a kind of stone shrine built against the face of a cliff, partially hidden by vegetation. Inside, he found disturbing objects that he lists in visibly shaky handwriting: bones arranged in circular patterns, stones stained with something dark, and more of those symbols engraved, now not just on wood, but carved directly into the rock. Nathaniel was beginning to understand that he had stumbled upon something far beyond a simple mapping expedition. The last complete diary entry is dated March 23, 1911. Nathaniel writes that he has finally decided to return, that he needs to report what he found to the authorities, that something terrible has happened in these mountains and may still be happening. He mentions having kept evidence, small objects that he collected from the stone shrine. He plans to go down the next morning, following a stream until he finds the main road, and then the entrance ends abruptly with an unsettling sentence. I hear footsteps outside my tent. They are not from animals. Nathaniel Burke's diary was found 6 weeks later by a fur trapper named Thomas Hargrove, who was following deer trails in nearby Madison County. Thomas was checking his traps when he noticed something unusual: pieces of torn fabric stuck in thorny bushes, forming a jagged trail that descended toward a narrow valley. He was both curious and a little scared, so he followed the tracks until he found a leather backpack that was half buried in wet leaves and broken branches. There was a diary, some measuring tools, a map that wasn't quite finished, and a small canvas bag with things that Thomas would later tell the sheriff were strange things that didn't belong there. When Thomas brought the diary to Marshall, the capital of Madison County, the police first thought it was just a simple accident. After all, it wasn't uncommon for men from the city to go alone into those mountains and never come back. Mistakes were not forgiven in Appalachia. If you make one mistake, you could fall to your death in a canyon. An unexpected storm could disorient even the most experienced explorers. Black bears were still common in the area. The simplest answer was usually the right one. But Sheriff Edmund Calloway, who had already worked as a federal marshal before moving to that quiet county, didn't like simple answers. He read the whole diary, page by page, and what he found there made him very upset. It wasn't the technical notes about topography or railroad routes that interested him. It was the last entries that talked about abandoned huts, strange symbols, and hidden stone structures. Edmund knew the mountains well because he had grown up there. He also knew the stories that his elders told in low voices, stories that most people didn't want to hear. Edmund put together a search party of 12 men, one of whom was Thomas Hargrove, who led them to the spot where the backpack was found. They left on a foggy May morning, when spring had already covered the mountains with thick leaves. The group took 3 days to get to the general area that Nathaniel's journal said they should go to. The trails were dangerous and often completely hidden by plants. More than once, the men thought about quitting and coming back, but Edmund wouldn't let them. Something in that diary disturbed him in a way he couldn't fully explain. On the 4th day of the search, they found the first clear sign of Nathaniel Burke. There was a camp that was only partially taken down in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The tent was still there, but it had been ripped in a few places, and the stakes were pulled out of the ground, as if something had pulled hard. There were kitchen tools all over the place within a few meters. Nathaniel's rifle was leaning against a tree, fully loaded but never fired. His extra clothes were soaked from weeks of rain and partially covered in moss, But there was no body, no blood, and no clear signs of fighting, just that scene of sudden chaos. The men looked around the camp. One of them, a farmer named William Jessup, found footprints about 50 yards from the site that made him uneasy. But those footprints weren't normal. William told Edmund and the others to come see. The marks on the wet ground looked like they were made by a person, but they were too big, not right, and the depth of the impressions made it seem like they were made by someone much heavier than a normal person. The footprints looked like they went around the camp several times, which was even worse. It was as if something had watched for hours before doing something. Edmund told them to follow the tracks. The marks on the ground led them down the mountain, through a forest that got thicker and thicker, until they reached a narrow canyon with a stream running between rocks covered in lichen. And it was there, in a bend in the creek where the water made a small dark well, that they found Nathaniel's second piece of equipment, his tool belt. It still had all of the tools on it, but the leather was ripped as if someone had pulled it off. James Porter, one of the men on the expedition, had fought in the war against Spain years before. He looked at the belt and quietly said that this kind of damage wasn't caused by wild animals or accidents. It was something on purpose, something with a lot of force. Edmund made a choice. Half of the group would go back to Marshall and get more men, supplies, and, if possible, an experienced tracker from outside the area. The other half, which included him, would keep looking. There was something in those mountains that needed to be found, and every hour that passed made it less likely that they would figure out what had really happened to Nathaniel Burke and, most likely, to Ezra Whitlock as well. The men all agreed, but it was clear that some of them would rather go down altogether. There was a feeling in the air, a tension that no one could put into words but that everyone felt. As 6 men went back to civilization, Edmund and the other 5 kept looking. They walked upstream along the stream because Nathaniel's journal said he had camped near running water a few times. The landscape got rougher and wilder as they moved forward. There were older trees there, and some had trunks so wide that 3 men couldn't hug them together. The thick canopy of leaves kept most of the sunlight from getting through. The sound of the stream echoed strangely between the valley's rocky walls, making a loud, watery noise that seemed to come from all directions at once. Thomas Hargrove, the hunter who had found the first backpack, was the first to see it. He suddenly stopped on the trail, raised his hand to signal silence, and pointed up to the face of a cliff that rose almost straight up to their right. It took the others a few seconds to see what he had seen, a structure that was partly hidden by vines and shrubs that grew in the cracks in the rock. It wasn't natural. Someone had stacked stones on purpose to make a low wall against the cliff face. The stone shrine looked just like Nathaniel had written about in his diary. It wasn't easy to get there. The men had to climb up using exposed roots and rocky ledges which could have killed them if they fell. But Edmund was determined. Everyone was quiet for a long time when they finally got to the building. The space was small, maybe 3 meters wide by 2 meters deep, and it looked like a fake cave in the solid rock. And inside, just like Nathaniel wrote, the bones were arranged in circles. It was clear right away that they weren't human bones. There were things that looked like they came from deer, bears, and big cats. But the way they were set up was very unnatural. Someone, or something, had made it with a reason. There were symbols all over the cave walls. Edmund had lived in that area all his life, and had only met a few Cherokee who still lived in the mountains, so he didn't know what they meant. These were different, maybe older, or made up entirely. Straight lines and curves crossed each other, making patterns that looked like they meant something, but were impossible to understand. When he saw the symbols, one of the men, a Methodist minister named the Reverend Samuel Yates, whispered a prayer. He said it had the mark of something sinful, something that shouldn't be in Christian countries. Edmund found something in the middle of the grotto that made his blood run cold. It was half buried under a thin layer of dirt and dry leaves. It was a little book with dark leather covers and pages that had turned yellow from moisture. That wasn't Nathaniel's diary, he already had it. This one was older and different. The pages were full of messy, tight, and almost frantic writing. The writing was in English, but the spelling was old-fashioned, which made it seem like the book had been written a long time ago, maybe even in the last century. In the dim light that came into the grotto, Edmund carefully flipped through the pages trying to figure out what they said. People never found out everything he read there. Edmund kept the book and only showed parts of it to some state officials weeks later. However, the 5 men who were with him at the time and saw his face change page after page all said the same thing later. The sheriff was clearly upset. His hands started to shake a little. He quickly closed the book, put it in his backpack, and told everyone to get down right away. He didn't say why. He only said that they needed to leave that place before dark. But they weren't able to. Even during the day, the downhill climb was dangerous, and the sun was already starting to set between the mountain peaks. Edmund chose to set up camp right there, at the bottom of the cliff by the stream. The men put up 2 tents, made a big fire, and took turns keeping watch all night. Everyone had trouble sleeping. Reverend Yates read his Bible for hours by the campfire, moving his lips in prayer. Thomas Hargrove always had his rifle close by and was watching the dark outside the circle of light. Edmund just sat there, staring at the flames and occasionally touching the backpack where he had kept the strange book. William Jessup, who was on watch, woke everyone up with a quiet but urgent whisper around 3 in the morning. He had heard something. He couldn't say for sure what it was, but there were sounds coming from the stone shrine above them. Maybe footsteps or something being dragged over the rocks. The men were completely quiet, barely breathing, and trying to hear anything other than the stream's constant murmur and the fire's crackling. Then they paid attention. It was far away and muffled, but there was definitely something up there that was heavy and moving. It caused small avalanches of boulders to roll down the canyon. Edmund pointed his flashlight at the cliff. The beam of light barely reached the height of the shrine, but for a short time, everyone swore they saw something. A shadowy figure that wasn't clearly defined but was definitely there, standing on the edge of the stone structure and watching them. Then, too quickly to be normal, the shape vanished. It just went back into the cave's shadows and there was no sound. The silence that came after was even scarier than the sounds that came before it. That night, no one went back to sleep. The men kept the fire going until it burned so brightly that it hurt, making a big circle of light around the camp. They spoke softly and shared stories they had heard over the years about those mountains. Some of these stories were about travelers who vanished without a trace, whole communities that left their homes and belongings behind, and strange sounds that echoed through the valleys on moonless nights. Stories that people had always thought were dumb superstitions meant to scare kids. But that night, under that cliff, none of those stories seemed so silly. The men rushed down the mountain when the sun finally came up, and the morning mist that always covered the valleys of Appalachia came with it. There was no more talk about continuing the search. Everyone agreed without saying anything that they had to leave that place. Edmund was in front, marching at a speed that didn't leave much time for rest. It took them 2 days to get back to Marshall, which was half the time it took them to get there. When they got to town, they were dirty, tired, and clearly shaken. They found the party that had come down earlier waiting for them, along with 15 other men who were volunteering, and even a reporter from the Asheville newspaper who had heard about the strange case of the missing cartographer. Edmund didn't want to talk to the reporter right away. First, he went straight to the office of Albert Morrison, the county judge. Morrison was a well-known and respected man who was also the highest legal authority in the area. Edmund and the judge were locked up together for 3 hours. No one knows for sure what was said at that meeting, but Judge Morrison looked just as upset as Edmund when they left. He called an emergency meeting with the mayor, the lead pastor, the local doctor, and some powerful landowners. That same night, the meeting took place behind closed doors in the county courthouse. The meeting led to an official decision. A new expedition would be planned, but this time, with the state's permission, enough resources, and trained men. It wouldn't be easy to find a missing explorer. It would be a full investigation of that part of the mountains. Judge Morrison wrote a telegram to North Carolina Governor William Kitchen himself, using carefully chosen words to explain the situation. He talked about the 2 men who had gone missing, the unsettling discoveries, and the need to find out what was going on in that faraway area. That same night, the telegram was sent. 3 days later, the governor's response came. He gave the go-ahead for the expedition and would send 10 men from the state militia to help, along with a special investigator from the capital. Henry Blackwood was the investigator. He was known for solving difficult cases involving disappearances and crimes in the countryside. Henry got to Marshall on June 12, 1911. He brought with him modern tools for the time, like cameras, forensic measuring tools, and even a basic sound recording device that he hoped to use to record testimony. Henry Blackwood was very organized. He spent a whole week talking to everyone involved before going up to the mountains. He told Thomas Hargrove how and where he found Nathaniel's backpack. He asked Edmund Calloway a lot of questions about everything he had seen and found. He read Nathaniel's diary 1 page at a time, taking detailed notes, and he also wanted to see the strange book that Edmund had found in the stone shrine. Edmund thought about it for a while, but then he did it. Henry took the book to his room at the boarding house and read it by lamplight for 2 nights. When Henry finally told them what he thought, it was both interesting and scary. He thought that the old book was a diary or record kept by a group of people who lived in those mountains many years ago, maybe in the early 1800s. The writings were incomplete and often hard to understand, but they talked about rituals, practices, and beliefs that didn't fit with any known religion or tradition. Henry wrote in his report that there was an isolated cult in the depths of Appalachia, away from the eyes of civilized society. He didn't want to go into too much detail about what they did in his official documents. The last pages of Henry Blackwood's analysis were the most disturbing part, not the content of the old book itself. Someone had written more notes there with a different, much newer ink. The writing was rushed, almost frantic, and the dates matched the last days Nathaniel Burke wrote about in his diary. Henry could read some of the notes. They're still here. The symbols are warnings, not decorations. Ezra knew that's why he ran away. And the most disturbing of all, they're not stories. They're records. The last note, which looked like it was written with a shaky hand, said only, "If anyone finds this, do not go up at night." It was Nathaniel's handwriting. Henry told Judge Morrison and Sheriff Calloway what he had found in a private meeting. He came up with a theory that made sense, but it also had some very disturbing consequences. Henry said that there was proof that a small group, maybe descendants or continuators of that old cult, still lived in the most remote parts of those mountains. Over time, they would have created their own culture that was completely separate from modern society. The abandoned hut Nathaniel found, the stone shrine, and the carved symbols all pointed to a secret group that wanted to stay hidden. Henry said he could only guess what would happen to Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock. Ezra, who lived nearby and might have known a lot about ancient stories, may have seen the danger and run away when Nathaniel started to explore places that were supposed to stay hidden. Or maybe he knew some of the people who lived in the mountains and acted as a kind of guardian to keep outsiders from getting too close. Henry thought that Nathaniel had found something that this secret group thought was sacred or off limits. What happened next Whether he was caught, killed, or just lost while trying to get away was never known. The last trip was planned for the start of July, and there were 25 men in all. 10 members of the state militia, Edmund Calloway, and 5 volunteers from the area, Henry Blackwood and his 2 helpers, and 7 porters hired to carry equipment and supplies. This was the biggest search ever done in that part of North Carolina. They brought enough tents, food, weapons, climbing gear, cameras, and even explosives in case they had to fight their way through landslides or areas with too much vegetation. The trip started on a clear, warm morning on July 6, 1911. Half of Marshall's people came out to see them off. Some were hoping to finally get answers, while others were quietly worried and showed it by looking worried and whispering blessings. Mother Thornton, an old woman who lived in the area, is said to have gone up to Henry Blackwood before he left and whispered in his ear, "The mountains hold what the mountains take. You won't find what you're looking for, but you'll find something." Henry wrote this down in his notebook as an interesting local superstition, but he didn't give the words too much weight. There weren't any major events in the first 5 days. The group took the same paths that Edmund and the others had taken before. They first went to the place where Nathaniel's camp had been destroyed, and then to the gorge where the tool belt was found. Henry took careful pictures of everything, measured distances, and gathered samples of soil and fabric. He was putting together a full file that could be used as strong proof in front of state officials. The militia set up a fortified base camp near the creek, where guards worked in shifts of 4 hours, and campfires burned all night. They got to the cliff with the stone shrine on the 6th day. This time, the climb was safer because there were more men and the right tools. Henry went upstairs with Edmund and 3 soldiers from the militia. The shrine was just as they had left it weeks before. The bones were still in their circles and the symbols on the walls had not been touched. But there was something different. There was now something else in the middle of the grotto, where Edmund had found the old book. Nathaniel's sketchbook, the one where he had drawn the signs he had seen in the first hut that was empty. Someone had written a message in plain English with charcoal on the design of the symbols on the open page of the notebook. It said, "Go away." The discovery sparked an immediate argument among men. Some people said that this showed that there were people living in those mountains who watched them, knew they were there, and wanted to scare them. Others, who were more scared, said they should listen to the warning and leave right away. Henry kept his cool and looked at the handwriting. It was different from Nathaniel's. It was more basic and clearly written by someone who didn't write much. This made him more sure of his idea that the community was cut off from the rest of the world. He decided that they would keep going, but with more safety measures. For example, the number of night guards was raised from 2 to 4 per shift, and all of them were told to keep their guns loaded and ready. That night, nothing happened again at the base of the cliff. No strange noises or movements in the dark. The silence was almost too normal to handle. The men started to relax a little, and some even joked that the warning might have scared the person who left it. But Edmund wasn't sure. He knew those mountains well enough to know that being completely quiet wasn't usually a good sign. It was usually because something bigger and more dangerous was nearby when nocturnal animals were completely quiet. Henry split the group on the 7th day. Half would stay at base camp, where they could stay safe and defend themselves. The other half, which included him, Edmund, and the more experienced militia soldiers, would search the area in ever-widening circles for more buildings, signs of life, or any clues that might lead them to Nathaniel and Ezra. They always went in groups of at least 5 men, and they never went so far that they couldn't hear the signal shots in case something happened. The group, led by Edmund, made the most important discovery. They found clear signs of recent human habitation about 2 miles from base camp, along a hunting trail that was almost impossible to see through a very thick forest. It wasn't a cabin or a permanent building, It was a series of temporary shelters made from branches, leaves, and bark that were cleverly hidden so they wouldn't stand out. There were old fires, boiled animal bones, and even some simple tools made of stone and wood. Someone had been there, and it wasn't that long ago. Edmund looked closely at the shelters. He thought they could fit 10 to 15 people. But the layout of the place was the most disturbing thing. The shelters were arranged in a semicircle, all facing the same place. A large, flat rock in the middle of the clearing that was stained with something dark that could be ancient blood, but it was hard to tell for sure without more testing. There were more of those symbols carved into the ground around the rock. They were made of small white stones that were carefully placed. Robert Lee, a 23-year-old soldier and son of a Civil War veteran, found something hidden under a pile of leaves near one of the shelters. It was a ripped piece of cloth that had already changed color from being exposed to time and humidity, but it was still recognizable. Edmund looked at it and felt his stomach tighten. The railroad company that hired Nathaniel Burke said that the material was the same as the shirt he wore when he left Asheville. A strong cotton fabric in a certain shade of navy blue that professionals who worked outside liked. There was no doubt. Edmund told everyone to look for more proof in that area. The men moved around the clearing, looking at every shelter and every nook and cranny where something might be hidden. They also found more pieces of clothing, a brass button that might have come from Nathaniel's waistcoat, and something even more interesting, one of the measuring tools on the cartographer's equipment list. A small pocket theodolite used to measure angles. The lens was broken, but it was clearly a tool for a professional surveyor. Nathaniel had been to that place sometime between the last time he wrote in his diary and now. There was no body, no human bones, and no clear sign of death. Just these few pieces of belongings scattered around as if they had been left behind or thrown away on purpose. Henry Blackwood, who was called to the scene 2 hours later by signal shots, stood there in silence for a long time, just watching and trying to figure out what might have happened in his head. His first thought was very disturbing. This place had been a place of judgment or ritual, and Nathaniel Burke had been brought there against his will. Henry told everyone to take a lot of pictures of the site. Every shelter, every sign, and every object they found. He wanted to write down everything with scientific accuracy so that the record could not be questioned or dismissed as the fantasies of superstitious people. Henry walked around the clearing taking measurements, notes, and sketches, while his main assistant, a very careful man named Frederick Walsh, worked with the camera. He was a logical man who had been taught to find logical explanations, but even he couldn't deny the growing feeling that they had found something much bigger than a simple crime. Henry called a meeting with all the men on the expedition that night at base camp. He talked about what they had found that day, showed the photos that had already been developed in a small, portable dark tent, and showed the pieces of clothing and the measuring tool. Then he asked a direct question. Did anyone there know of small groups of people living in these mountains? Had anyone heard of groups of people living completely apart from the rest of society? The men in the area gave each other uncomfortable looks. Everyone was afraid to be the first to speak. Reverend Yates was the one who finally spoke up. He told a story that his grandfather had told him years before about a group of people who had moved to those mountains even before the War of Independence. They weren't natives, but they weren't just regular settlers either. History says they were religious refugees from Europe who had fled persecution and were looking for a place where they could practice their faith without being bothered. But the Reverend's grandfather said that his beliefs were not Christian. They were something much older and darker, and as the years went by, these people would have changed into something else, something that didn't act or behave like a normal person anymore. Other men from the area said they had heard similar versions of the story. Some people thought it was the fault of Europeans, while others thought it was the fault of settlers' descendants who had gone crazy from being alone. There were differences, but the main idea stayed the same. There was, or had been, a group deep in Appalachia that didn't want to be around other people and got angry when their privacy was invaded. Most people who lived in the area just stayed away from certain parts of the mountains, following invisible lines that had been passed down from generation to generation through hints and warnings. Henry paid close attention and wrote down what he heard. He stayed quiet for a moment after everyone else was done to gather his thoughts. Then he said something that shocked a lot of people who were there. He thought that the stories were based on real events. There was enough proof to say that some group of people lived in those mountains permanently or semi-permanently, but he also thought that this group was made up of real people, not ghosts or demons. And if they were real people, they could be found, confronted, and, if necessary, punished for any crime they had committed. The trip would go on. But Henry made new rules. No one could leave the main group with fewer than 8 men. Everyone would always have a weapon. Signal fires would be set up in important places to help people find their way if they got lost. And more importantly, they would not remain in the region after dark unless absolutely necessary. Each day, after completing their exploration, they would return to base camp before dusk. It was a military protocol adapted to the circumstances, and everyone agreed that it made sense. Over the next few days, the expedition systematically mapped an area of approximately 15 square kilometers around the base camp. They found 3 more sets of temporary shelters, all abandoned but clearly used in recent months. They discovered nearly invisible trails that connected these locations, forming a network of paths that someone who knew the area well could use to move quickly and unseen. They also located 2 natural caves that showed signs of human occupation. Ashes from ancient campfires, tool marks on the walls, even some primitive drawings that resembled prehistoric rock art, but were clearly much more recent. In one of these caves, the deepest and darkest of the 2, they found something that made several men instinctively retreat. Hanging from stalactites near the entrance were animal skulls, dozens of them: deer, bears, coyotes, even some that appeared to be domestic animals like goats or pigs. All had been meticulously cleaned, bleached by time, and were strung with vegetable fibers in arrangements that formed a kind of macabre curtain. They clearly served as a warning or territorial demarcation, a nonverbal message but perfectly understandable. This belongs to someone. Stay away. Henry photographed the skulls extensively. He also ventured deeper into the cave, accompanied by Edmund and 4 soldiers carrying lanterns and torches. The cave stretched for perhaps 50 meters, gradually descending, the ceiling getting lower and lower until it was necessary to bend to continue. And then, at the deepest point, they found a space that had been deliberately modified. The floor was level, the walls had been smoothed with tools, and there was a raised platform built of flat stones stacked together. On the platform, more engraved symbols, and around it, concentric circles of small white stones identical to those they had seen in the clearing of the shelters. But what drew the most attention was what was in the center of the platform. It was an object wrapped in tanned leather, tied with tendon ropes. Henry hesitated before touching it. There was something deeply wrong with that scene, something that challenged his rational confidence, but he was an investigator, and investigators needed to investigate carefully. He cut the ropes with his knife and unfolded the hide. Inside were bones, human bones, not a complete skeleton, but specific parts. A skull, both hands complete with all the small bones still connected, and what appeared to be a sternum. The bones were clean, bleached, treated with some kind of substance that made them look almost polished. Edmund crossed himself. The soldiers retreated a few steps. Henry remained on his knees, examining the bones with his flashlight. He was not a doctor, but he had seen enough human bones in his work to recognize certain characteristics. The skull was that of an adult, possibly male, based on the robust structure. There was an old fracture on the right side of the skull, which had healed long before death. And there was something else. Engraved directly into the front bone, using some fine and precise tool, was one of the symbols they had seen over and over again, the same pattern of intertwined lines, permanently marked on the bone itself. Henry wrapped the bones again with extreme care and decided to take them back to base camp. This was crucial evidence, possibly the most concrete proof they had found that serious crimes were being committed in those mountains. But it also raised disturbing questions. The bones were ancient, clearly from someone who had died years, perhaps decades earlier. They were not Nathaniel Burke's, that was clear. So, whose were they? How many other people had disappeared in that region over the years without anyone properly investigating? How many other sets of bones would be hidden in the countless caves and remote valleys of Appalachia? When they returned to base camp that afternoon, Henry called another meeting. He explained the discovery and his intention to stop the expedition within 2 days, not because he considered the mission complete, but because he had collected enough evidence to justify a much larger operation, one that would require resources that he simply didn't have there. He needed to return to Raleigh, present his findings to state, possibly even federal authorities, and organize an appropriate response. That could mean bringing in dozens of men, perhaps as many as 100, to systematically comb the entire mountain region. But not everyone agreed with what Henry did. Edmund Calloway, who had been quiet for most of the trip since they found the warning at the stone shrine, finally spoke up. He said that waiting weeks or months to plan a bigger expedition would give the people who lived in those mountains time to leave or hide all the evidence. Now that they had men and resources in place, they had a chance to find the people who did it and maybe even find out what happened to Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock. If they waited, they would be leaving the 2 men to their fate, unless they were already dead. The argument went on for hours and got more and more heated. Some men backed Edmund, especially those who lived in the area and felt responsible for the missing people. Some people agreed with Henry and said that they weren't ready or had enough people to take on a whole community that knew the area much better than they did. Reverend Yates had a different point of view. He said that maybe they should talk instead of fight, leaving messages, offering peace, and making sure they knew they weren't going to hurt anyone. Robert Lee, the young soldier who found Nathaniel's first piece of clothing, brought up something that no one had really thought about. He said out loud that he was curious if anyone else had noticed that they had never really seen a single person in all those days of exploring the area. Empty shelters, things left behind, and written notices were the only signs of people being there. It was like the people who lived there were always one step ahead, watching them and avoiding them on purpose. What did that mean? Were there so few that they couldn't risk a fight, or were there so many that they could just back off and wait for the invaders to leave? No one knew the answers to these questions, and the expedition spent its last planned night in those mountains in an atmosphere of uncertainty and rising tension. Henry had made up his mind that they would come back the next morning, even though Edmund didn't want them to. As a special investigator chosen by the governor, he had the power to make the final decision. Edmund didn't want to do this, but he did it anyway. As the men got ready for bed, some were happy to finally be leaving that place, while others were angry that they didn't get any clear answers before they left. But the night had other ideas. Around midnight, the night guards saw something strange. Small, dim lights, like flashlights or torches, moving through the woods near the camp. There were dozens of them, not just 1 or 2. They were all moving slowly toward the camp in a semicircle in the distance. The guards woke everyone up right away. Within minutes, the 25 men on the expedition were up, armed, and standing guard around the tents and fires. Henry grabbed a megaphone he had brought just for talking and yelled into the dark. He said he was from the North Carolina government and that they had no bad intentions, They just wanted to know what happened to 2 missing men. He told anyone outside to come closer to talk, making sure that no one would get hurt. His voice echoed through the valleys, bouncing off the rock walls and making layers of sound that slowly faded away into the night. There was no answer. The lights kept getting closer, slowly but surely. Edmund said to fire warning shots into the air as a show of force to stop any attack. But Henry said no. They didn't know how many people were out there or what they really wanted. One shot could start a fight that they weren't sure they could win. He told everyone to keep their weapons ready but pointed downwards, to feed the fires until they burned as brightly as possible, and to wait. They would defend themselves if they were attacked, but they wouldn't shoot first. The lights went out about 100 meters from the camp's edge. They stood still, making a jagged line that went through the trees. The men on the expedition waited, tense, with their fingers on the triggers and their eyes trying to see shapes, numbers, or anything else that would give them a tactical edge beyond the fires. Minutes felt like hours. The only noise was the crackling of the fire and the men who were ready to fight breathing slowly. Then a voice came from the dark. It wasn't shouted, but it was carried in a way that made it clear it got to the camp. There was a man speaking English with a strange, old-fashioned accent, as if he were using words and sounds from a different time. The voice said, "You have been told to leave." After a pause, it said, "The man of the city you are looking for is with his ancestors now." The guide who went with him was smart enough to run away when there was still time. There will be no more warnings. Then, all of a sudden, the lights went out. The forest's darkness swallowed everything up again. Henry yelled again, asking the person to come back, talk, and make some kind of deal, but no one answered. The men stayed in a defensive position until dawn, but nothing else happened. Henry and Edmund took a group of people to where the lights had been when it was finally light enough to see. There were a lot of footprints on the wet ground. They also found pieces of torches made from branches wrapped in cloth soaked in something flammable that was still smoking, but no people. Whoever was there had completely vanished into the woods, leaving behind only these small signs of their presence. That same morning, the expedition came down from the mountains. There was no more arguing about staying. Even Edmund agreed that things had gotten too dangerous. They got a clear message. Nathaniel Burke was dead, and they should leave while they still could. There was no doubt about what the threat meant. They marched back to Marshall in a tight formation, always on guard, but nothing followed them. It took them 2 days. It was like the people who lived on the high ground just let them go once they started to go down. The expedition's arrival in Marshall caused a lot of noise right away. Half of the city came out to greet them, eager for news, but the looks on the faces of the men who had come back did not promise good news. Henry Blackwood went straight to Judge Morrison's office with all the evidence he had gathered. The pictures, the carefully packaged human bones, the pieces of Nathaniel's clothes, and his detailed notes. Edmund Calloway was with him, and they worked on a full report for state officials for the rest of that day and all night. The report was an amazing piece of writing that would eventually make its way to the Capitol and be kept in North Carolina's official records. Henry didn't try to hide or downplay anything they had found. He talked about the symbols, the shrines, the shelters, the cave with the bones, and the last fight on the last night. Their official conclusion was that the most remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains in Madison County were home to a small community, possibly made up of descendants of religious groups that were on the fringes or not very well known. This group did rituals that involved using the remains of people and animals, fought off intruders to protect their land, and was responsible for the deaths of at least 2 people in the last few years, Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock. Henry suggested that the whole military should get involved. Not just the state militia, but maybe even federal troops. He thought that a well-planned search that could actually find and confront people living in the mountains would need at least 200 men, the right equipment for working in the mountains, and a few months of planning. It also said that doctors and anthropologists should go on the expedition to make sure that any finds were properly documented and that anyone who was captured was treated humanely, especially if there were children or people who might be being held against their will. The report was sent to Raleigh by express mail, along with the most disturbing pictures and a letter from Henry to Governor Kitchen explaining how urgent the situation was. It took 3 weeks for the answer to come. It was very disappointing when it finally got here. The governor thanked Henry for his hard work, recognized how serious the results were, and told him that the state budget didn't have enough money for an operation of that size. At the time, North Carolina was having its own economic problems, and it wasn't possible to send hundreds of men and a lot of money to look into remote mountains. Because it was impossible to find the body, the governor instead suggested that Nathaniel Burke's case be officially declared an accidental expedition death with unknown causes. Since Ezra Whitlock lived in the area and seemed to have left on his own, there was no legal reason to keep looking for him. The governor said that there were probably people living alone in those mountains, but he also said that it wasn't a crime to choose to live apart from society, as long as there was no clear proof of violent crimes against specific people. Henry was very angry with the answer. He had put his own life and the lives of other men in danger, carefully gathered proof of criminal activity, and was now being told that nothing would be done. He thought about going public with his story, going to the newspapers, and putting pressure on the government to act. But Judge Morrison, who was older and wiser, told him not to do it. If the case is made public, vigilantes and bounty hunters could go into those mountains, which would lead to violence that doesn't need to happen and could put innocent communities living near the remote areas in danger. Henry didn't want to, but he knew there was nothing else he could do through official channels. He stayed in Marshall for 2 more weeks, talking to older people, gathering oral histories, and trying to learn more about the history of that area. What he found was both interesting and scary. A few older people remembered stories their grandparents had told them about the people of the Heights, as they were known. People didn't think they were dangerous if they were left alone, but there were rules that everyone followed without question. For example, certain trails weren't used, certain valleys were avoided, and any sign that someone wanted privacy was respected. Henry heard something very interesting from an older woman who must have been at least 80 years old. She remembered seeing a group of people come down from the mountains to trade in the city when she was a child, maybe in the 1840s. They brought animal skins, herbs that could help with sickness, and beautifully made wooden things. They spoke English, but with a strange accent, and even for that time, they wore clothes that were out of style. They traded quickly, always in silence, and only talked when they needed to make a deal. Then they went back into the mountains. When she was younger, this happened once or twice a year, but it got less and less common until it stopped happening completely. Henry wrote all of this down very carefully. He was starting to put together a more complete theory. Maybe these people weren't violent criminals by nature, but just a group that had chosen to live alone and reacted defensively when their privacy was invaded. Nathaniel Burke crossed a line when he went to their holy or important places and took things from the stone shrine. His death should serve as a warning to others who might think about doing the same thing. It didn't make sense of what had happened, but it did give me a way to think about it. Henry never found out what Ezra Whitlock's true destiny was. The local guide just vanished and was never seen again in Marshall or any other town nearby. There were 2 options. Either he had really run away when he realized how dangerous it was and started a new life somewhere far away, or he was somehow connected to the people who lived in the mountains and had gone back to them. Henry didn't trust the second one. Ezra knew the trails well enough to know where not to go, and he tried to warn Nathaniel. Maybe he was a middleman, someone who lived between two worlds. When that line was crossed, he just went back to the side where he really belonged. At the end of August 1911, Henry Blackwood left Marshall. He went back to Raleigh and kept working as a special investigator, but the Nathaniel Burke case stayed with him for the rest of his career. He kept all of his files, photos, and notes in boxes that were carefully organized. After he died in 1938, the boxes were given to the state archives. These papers are still there today, and anyone who wants to can look them up. They are a silent record of one of the strangest and most mysterious cases in North Carolina history. Edmund Calloway was sheriff of Madison County for another 15 years. He never planned trips to those mountains again. In fact, he became one of the strongest supporters of leaving some places completely alone. When young adventurers or explorers came to the city to map out faraway places, Edmund always told them not to go. Sometimes he even made the natural dangers of the area seem worse than they were to keep them away. He had seen something in those mountains that completely changed how he saw things. It wasn't just fear. It was also a kind of grudging respect for the fact that a group of people wanted to stay completely separate from the modern world. After Nathaniel Burke went missing, there were other strange things that happened from time to time. For example, in 1917, a hunter who went on an expedition never came back, and in 1923, 2 college students who went hiking got lost and were never found. Edmund looked into each case to some extent, but he always came to the same conclusion. People had gone where they shouldn't have, and the mountains had taken them. He never talked about the small community in public again. He kept that information to himself, only telling trusted successors and people he thought needed to know for public safety reasons. The railroad company that hired Nathaniel Burke eventually gave up on its plans to build more lines through that part of Appalachia. The official reasons for the decision were economic and the difficulty of the terrain, but historians found internal company documents decades later that suggest the real reason was Nathaniel's disappearance and the scary report that Henry Blackwood shared with company executives in private. It wasn't worth the risk to send more men to a place where they couldn't be sure of their safety. The region remained without railroad development, without modern roads, essentially frozen in time as the rest of North Carolina moved into the 20th century. Over the years, the stories about Nathaniel Burke and what happened that winter in 1911 became local legends. Some details were left out, others were blown out of proportion, and some were made up. Some people think Nathaniel just got lost and died from the cold. For some, wild animals attacked him. And for those who knew the darker versions of the story, he had found out secrets that the mountains kept safe, and he had paid the ultimate price for being curious. Every generation told the story a little differently, but the main point stayed the same. There were places in those mountains where outsiders weren't welcome, and those who didn't listen to the warnings would face serious consequences. In 1962, a private collector of historical documents bought Nathaniel Burke's diary from Madison County. This collector, who was very interested in history, tried to put together his own trip to find the places mentioned in the diary. In the summer of 1964, he took a group of 6 men who were all experienced in climbing and exploring to the mountains for 2 weeks. They were able to find some of the general areas Nathaniel talked about, but the specific landmarks had changed over the course of more than 50 years. Landslides had changed the land, plants had grown and covered up old buildings, and they couldn't find either the stone shrine or the cave with the bones. They also didn't find any signs of people living there recently. It was like everything had gone back into the woods. But something important happened on that trip in 1964. On the last night before they went down, the collector and his friends camped in a valley that they thought was close to where Nathaniel had made his last camp. They heard something. Henry Blackwood's expedition didn't hear people fighting. Instead, they heard something more subtle. human voices singing in a language none of them knew, echoing through the mountains from a source that couldn't be pinpointed exactly. The noise lasted for about 15 minutes before fading into the quiet of the night. When they got up in the morning, they all agreed not to tell anyone else about it. But the collector wrote in his personal diary, "There is something alive in these mountains besides animals and trees, something old that chose to stay hidden." And maybe that's for the best. With the rise of satellite technology and digital mapping in the last few years, almost every square inch of the United States has been photographed and put into a database. Curious researchers occasionally scan images of the remote regions of Madison County, looking for anomalies, man-made structures, any sign that Nathaniel Burke's story had a foundation in tangible reality. Some claim to have found suspicious rock formations, clearings that appear to have intentional patterns, even what could be paths or trails connecting inaccessible areas. But satellite imagery can be misleading. Shadows look like structures. Natural formations mimic human design, and no one really knows what to look for. The truth is that even today, that part of Appalachia is one of the least populated and least developed parts of North Carolina. There are valleys where modern people hardly ever go, forests so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground, and caves that have never been fully explored or mapped. If they really wanted to, it's easy to picture something or someone staying hidden there for generations. The mountains are vast, and civilization, however advanced it has become, still occupies only the accessible margins and valleys, leaving the heights largely untouched. What really happened to Nathaniel Burke? Was he killed by an isolated community that saw his exploitation as desecration of sacred sites? Did he get lost and succumb to the elements, with his body eventually being discovered and ritualized by people who practiced customs we don't understand? Or is there a completely different explanation, something that neither Henry Blackwood nor Edmund Calloway nor any subsequent investigator has been able to conceive? More than a century later, we still don't have definitive answers, just fragments of evidence, second-hand testimonies, and that silent diary with its last unsettling entry about nocturnal footsteps. The case of Nathaniel Burke reminds us of something important about the nature of the United States in the early 20th century. As much as we like to think that the country was completely mapped, completely civilized, and completely known at that time, the truth is that there were still blank spaces on the map, places where the reach of the federal, state, or even local government simply did not reach in a meaningful way. Communities that lived lives completely separate from the main national narrative, following their own rules, maintaining their own traditions, protecting their own secrets with fervor that might seem fanatical to outsiders, but that made perfect sense within their own cultural logic. We, looking back across the distance of more than a century, can easily judge those who allowed the case to remain unsolved. Why didn't the governor send troops? Why did Edmund Calloway eventually stop looking? Why didn't Henry Blackwood insist more aggressively? But they lived in a different world, with different priorities and different understandings of what was possible or desirable. Perhaps they made decisions that in that context made sense, or maybe they simply came across something that transcended their ability to cope properly and chose the path of least resistance. The Appalachian Mountains still stand as they always have, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on their slopes and valleys. Trees grow, seasons change, streams continue to flow over ancient rocks, and somewhere in those heights, perhaps there are still descendants of those Nathaniel Burke found. Or maybe not. Perhaps time and the inevitable expansion of modern civilization finally caught up with them, and they dispersed, integrated, or simply ceased to exist as a distinct group. We don't know, and perhaps it is appropriate that we do not know. Some mysteries deserve to remain mysteries. Some stories deserve open endings that leave us wondering. What we can say for sure is that Nathaniel Burke, a 32-year-old cartographer from Richmond, set out in March of 1911 to map routes through Appalachia and never returned. His diary survived, his tools were found, and fragments of his clothes appeared in strange places, but the man himself has completely disappeared, swallowed up by mountains that guard their secrets as jealously as any locked vault. And in his attempt to map the unknown, he himself became part of that unknown. A story whispered in dark nights, a warning about the dangers of excessive curiosity, a reminder that even in the modern world there are still boundaries that perhaps we shouldn't cross. This was the horrific story of Nathaniel Burke, a man who searched for answers deep in the Appalachian Mountains and found only more questions. If you were intrigued by this case, if the dark mountains and their ancient secrets piqued your curiosity, help us keep bringing these lost stories back to light. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next dives into historical mysteries that time has tried to erase. Leave a like if this journey through the mountains of North Carolina has you hooked until the end, and tell us in the comments, do you believe that there are still places in the United States where isolated communities live completely separated from the modern world? Your opinion matters, and we love reading every comment.